Well, welcome to Church is Canceled. I'm your co-host, Brett, here, joined by my co-host, Dr. Bombay. And today we're doing something unique, something special we've never done before. We are having a guest on. We are joined by another doctor, I believe, in contrast to Dr. Bombay, a real doctor.
I treat people's feet. I'm a podiatrist.
Save your rebuttal for later, Dr. Bombay. Today, we are joined by a longtime friend of mine, former New Testament professor, now radical theologian and author, who'll be discussing her book with us. The title of the book is Safer Than the Known Way, Dr. Maria Francesca French. Maria, how are you?
I'm so good. I'm really excited to be on this podcast with you guys today.
You shouldn't be, but okay.
I am so ready for this ride. Well, first of all, Brett and I go way back, and I have such a fondness and an affection for Brett. And Danny, I don't know you super well, but I think you're hilarious, and I think we're gonna have a really good time today. So
I'll take it.
I hope we are. I sure hope so.
Well, I mean, obviously we'll get in the thick of things too, but I think it's going to be unlike a podcast or interview I've done thus far on this book. So. High expectations for you two. So kick it into gear here.
Please lower them. This is what I tell women all the time. Whatever your expectations are of me, let's just get rid of those right away. It's the only path to happiness and peace.
So yeah, let's jump in. I wanted to give a little bit of a background, and then just hear your summation of the book, Maria. So I think our background, like I said, you were my New Testament professor when I was attending North Central University, formerly North Central Bible College. Mm-hmm. Man, when was I there? I graduated in 2014. I think you were in my first year, freshman or sophomore. So yeah, it would have had to be 2012 or so when we had met.
Yeah.
So we're now in 2023. We've kept in contact a little bit here and there as we could, as you're all over the world. You're in, where are you now?
Paris at the moment.
Paris, Tennessee, one of my favorite places in Tennessee. It's a really good town.
I'm not too far away. I'm in Bucharest at the moment. My employer is detained, so for the next month or so I'm here.
Fabulous.
Paris, France. That's cool.
Paris, France. Absolutely.
What are you doing there?
Having some time away. You know, my husband and I, my husband of a little over 2 years, we live in the UK. He's British, and I'm having a very big birthday this week, my 40th birthday in a few days from now. And, you know, I love France. I think, you know, I've lived in south of France. I'm back and forth to Paris fairly frequently. But we just said, let's do Paris for a full month. Let's just go there for more than a week or two. Let's pretend like, you know, we live there. So that's what we're doing here. And plus, my book release happened just a few days ago. And so there's just a lot to celebrate.
Yes.
We were excited. We both work from our laptops, so we can work from anywhere in the world. The freedom's great. So yeah, we're here.
Awesome. Tell us the title of the book again, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Safer Than the Known Way, a Post-Christian Journey. And it's just come out.
What does post-Christian mean to you?
Yeah, so that is like the $1 million question. That is the question that everyone's asking. And you just open up a can of worms to even start with that question from the beginning. But let's do it. I mean, it could definitely be a whole podcast. It's definitely at the very least a whole book, right? So, but essentially I use post-Christian in a way where I have not really seen it used before. Typically, when people talk about post-Christian or post-Christian culture, you know, they're referencing atheism, they're referencing secular humanism, at the very least, secular, godless culture and ideas of life and meaning making and all of these things. But for me, I use post-Christian in a way that, you know, some theologians and philosophers would use a term like post-theism or post-God, really post-belief, post-anything, because it's a very different thing to say you're post-theist as opposed to atheist, or even agnostic, or theist. Those things all have constructs that are really centered and grounded in the idea of the existence of God and the being of God, and a lot of metaphysical and supernatural realities. And when you say something like post-Christian, you're still attaching yourself to this narrative that has shaped you and formed you in some way, but you're saying you're past it, and you're engaging it as you're past it. You're engaging God, you're engaging faith, you're engaging Christianity, you're engaging all of these things very differently, because your orientation has changed to the story and to the idea of faith. So in that sense, we're after Christianity, we're engaging Christianity after it, we're engaging God after God. And when I say God, I mean the big G God, the God that lives in the sky, that is an interventionist God, a personal God, that big G God. We're engaging little G God after big G God. So that is sort of a little crash course on how I would describe post-Christianity, but of course it's a rabbit hole and I could keep going, but I'll stop there for now.
That's all right.
I think
did that get us going, you guys?
That's going to do more than get us going. Yeah, I think you first mentioned some ideas of post-Christianity to me maybe around 2018 or so. Dr. Bombay had fled Texas already, leaving me alone and hopeless. And I remember having conversations about post-Christianity, and you had mentioned some authors that you reference in your book. You quote and reference Caputo quite a bit. Derrida, is that how you correctly pronounce?
Well
and I don't remember the anatheism. Is it Kearney?
Yeah, well done.
So I remember reading some of that back then in 2018. You had mentioned it. Now reading your book and seeing you synthesize their material, it made a lot more sense to me. I think when I first heard about post-Christianity from you, I was thinking like this is a new sect or religion or denomination or something like that. But going through it again, I feel like I realized it's nothing new. There's no new doctrine we're required to believe in post-Christianity. It's more of just a moving on and through and past what I've experienced in Christianity, continuing the narrative of my story, stepping into the darkness, as you reference, and knowing, as you said, it holds more truth and enlightenment than the absolutes and certainties of Christianity or the religions, and beginning where you end, as I think you say a little bit later in your book, to kind of quote you loosely.
Yeah.
Does that sound fair?
Yeah, very
I'm
fair.
kind of understanding
you
it
clearly
now.
read the book.
Nice.
You clearly read the book. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I thumbed through the screener. Don't say that I didn't.
Danny looked at the cover art. He said it looked cool.
I don't know
I'm glad you liked the cover. Yeah, I'm glad you liked the cover. It's gotten a lot of press.
Maria, you said in the beginning that you wrote this book for Christians who feel lost and theologically homeless. That resonated with me. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, I wrote a book that I wish I had like 20 years ago, at the very least 15 years ago. So I wrote the book for a past version of me and a present and future version of my readers and anyone who might need this book. For me, I got to a time in my life, in every area of my life, including, the faith and the Christian and the theological part of life, where I really felt like I was coasting. Things were changing for me, philosophically and theologically speaking, and I just wasn't sure about things. The one thing I was sort of sure about was atheism was not going to be a good fit for me. I was not willing to say God exists versus absolutely, or he doesn't exist absolutely. I wasn't willing to check my entire spiritual narrative at the door. And by that, I just mean, when people are Christians, especially of a more fundamental brand like evangelicalism or, charismatic denominations, whatever, you tend to really stake your entire identity in your beliefs. And when those beliefs start to falter or flail or even, fade into the background a bit, really, truly an identity crisis ensues. And there are a lot of people falling through the cracks who really have moved past traditional notions of Christianity, but atheism is just not good enough and has long been, stale and boring and very much past its sell-by date. And And so, yeah, this book has been written for a lot of people who feel like the very modern, and by modern, I mean binary choices that have been put in front of them are simply, not only are they not good enough, but they just cannot hold the full dimensionality and complexity that our humanity requires. So this book is for them in a sense, really anyone who's interested in any kind of faith, even if you're an atheist.
In thumbing through the screener, I noticed that you repeat the title of the book quite frequently. Is this a cult brainwashing tactic?
No, a few people that I had edit the book asked me about that. And for me, it's a creative choice. It's a sort of a poetic move on my part, I guess, to just say this, and this, as I see it, is safer than the no, because I think that the title has intrigued a lot of people. If you read the introduction, I talk about where the title comes from and specifically, the inspiration for that. But then I go on to reauthor it and I go on to give it real depth. And so by, reiterating the title throughout the book, it just further opens up, the path that is safer than the known way. See, I just did it there.
Maria, don't you think it's safer, at least a lot of people, they cling to their doctrines and their beliefs and their certainties because that makes them feel safe. And when you tell someone, no, it's safer to step off the cliff into the unknown, don't you think they're going to say, no, you got to be out of your mind?
Yeah, I do. I do. It's an interesting thing right now. Part of the reason why I wrote this book at this point in time is because, there is an entire movement at a pop culture level that is going by the term deconstruction. And essentially what they're doing is, they're dismantling, they're disentwining, even deconverting and,
mythologizing.
Thank you. Demythologizing. Thank you. You're going to have to edit that part out.
No, I can't do it.
Or not, leave it in.
Yeah.
They're deconverting and they're dismantling they're disentangling, they're de-evolving, there's a lot of D's happening in this deconstruction conversation. Now I've just totally thrown myself off. Sorry, go back to that original question because there was a reason why I was going down that. Oh, right. Sorry. The safer piece. Right.
Yeah, isn't it safer to have some doctrine to cling to?
Yeah. So like right now with this big pop culture conversation on deconstruction and people are just leaving evangelicalism and like the wider, Christian understanding of church really en masse. There's a very kind of quick turnaround to rebuild up something in its place, because I think there needs to be that tethering, that anchoring. We dismantle from something really toxic, but we still want to sort of keep ourselves connected in some ways. And that's okay. But I think we need to be very real and honest about what it is we're doing, which is, our addiction to certainty, our kind of intrinsic human need to know, and that all feels really safe. But it's not an overnight thing. And, I say even towards the end of the book, like, this is essentially a lifelong commitment to unraveling some of this stuff with no promise, with no guarantee that you're ever going to arrive, anywhere of note. But the journey in and of itself is theological. Not to be trite, but the journey in and of itself is sort of a destination if you needed one. The point is to journey and to traverse and to.
Because of the Miley Cyrus song about that. Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh. It's the
climb.
It's the
climb.
It's the climb.
That's the one.
It's the theological climb.
Yeah.
The theological climb. So in that sense, sorry, this is like really windy, and that's why I keep losing my place in our conversation. But in that sense, it's not, an overnight thing where all of a sudden you give up certainty and you feel really safe and peaceful the next day. Like there is a lot of grief and a lot of darkness and a lot of sort of feeling around in the shadows and trying to, hear those whispers and those ghosts and that taunting and that teasing that I sort of talk about in the book, in this sense of, hauntology and all of that. There is this time period where you feel so, unsupported and untethered, I guess, in a sense. But once you move through some of those things that used to hold you so tightly, I do think, at least for me, I started to experience a real sense of peace and freedom by not being caught up in so much certainty. For example, being absolutely sure of afterlife constructs in terms of heaven and hell, being absolutely sure, well, the cross meant this, and, this Bible verse means that. Once we start to let these things go and actually tread very lightly with a humility that is very much appropriate for things that it's impossible to know with certainty about, there is, I think, a sense of peace and safety that comes with that, because you are truly leaning into your humanity and the fullness of that. And I do think that is safer. Now, I know, and that not everybody would agree with me there, but I think the proof is in the living. So, someone actually has to go through it and figure it out before they can decide if it's safe for them.
Yeah, I agree. you mentioned deconstruction. I know that's a big topic in the book. Danny, we've talked about deconstruction on the podcast before.
Yeah.
Any additional thoughts now applying deconstruction to this context?
I mean, my thoughts are pretty simple that, in the course of doing this podcast, hilariously, I've had the opposite effect of what I expected. And I found so much peace with, great, the mega church is sucking up $20 million a year, but there's one family in there that's getting a free pizza on Wednesdays, and it matters that they get that. And I feel like, I've gone through a period of deconstruction, although I never used that terminology. I always thought I don't like doing anything that's too pop culture-y. And in a very circular way, I ended up back somewhere where I started, which is odd, but yeah, not what I had anticipated.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions I wrote for this interview, but
yeah, you did.
I highlighted some of the important ones because I don't think I'm going to get to ask all of them.
No, ask away.
Maria, you kind of mentioned the hauntology.
Yeah.
And you talk in your book a lot about God existing as an event instead of a being. Yeah. I still have no idea what that means. Can you please explain?
Yeah, well, in some sense, and you'll probably hate this answer, and I'll give you more than this, but in some sense, we're really not even supposed to understand it. In some, that goes Danny.
I do hate that. I do hate it.
I know, but I'm not going to leave you there. I'm just going to sort of preface with that, and I only say it because language only can take us so far. Like words and communication and language and all of these things that we try and do to, communicate what we're actually feeling and thinking and experiencing and going through, it's never enough. It always falls short. And so we do our best. So event is another example of trying to speak of the unspeakable in ways that just aren't quite good enough. But, we're all sort of doing our best. The philosophers are doing their best. We're doing our best to try and understand it, whatnot. But essentially, event is theological, philosophical language that has, in the last 15 to 20 years been appropriated in theological circles. And essentially, it's asking the question, so we give an event a name, AKA God. But really what we want to know is what is happening in the name of the event. Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek says it like this. He says, event is a traumatic intrusion of something new, which means unacceptable, which means that it's unacceptable for the predominant worldview. So essentially, an event is an idea that comes to completely disrupt and interrupt the status quo. Okay, so anything we know, anything that we've sort of have an expectation for, anything that we have a precedent for, that we can see coming on the horizon, event comes and smashes that to hell, essentially, in a way that we could have never expected. And the idea is that event comes to us again and again and again. And every time it does, it's different. And every time we engage event, we're different because of it. And so when we start to house event in language like God, and we domesticate it and we contain it and we name it, it essentially loses its, transformative power, if I could even use that word power. So that, again, a little crash course on event. It's one of these really kind of deep, weird things to think about that really can get your brain in a tongue tie. And I pepper it throughout the book just to sort of get the reader sort of, you know, having this language rolling around in their head. And I do my best to sort of talk about event and experience as opposed to object and being. And the reason why those terms are put up against each other is because, you know, essentially God exists for us because we believe God exists, right? We believe that God is this real entity, this agency, this force, this consciousness, you know, that acts on our behalf in the world and beyond. So in that sense, we have said God is being, and that is an objective reality. Language like event and experience come along to say, nope. Anything we want to say about quote unquote God, again, the language we use to house intrusions in good ways, is completely plastic in terms of being, you know, open to plasticity. It's completely, you know, movable. It is completely transient. It is completely wild. So that's why those words are sort of put up against each other, just to give, not so that we all can become philosophers of, you know, really weird, lofty concepts, but to try and introduce something new into the imaginations of people who have held long time faith and beliefs that seem utterly immobile, if that makes sense. So this is just a little prick, you know, cerebrally, intellectually, faithfully, to just try and open up people's imaginations to what else God could be in the world.
I think that maybe helped a little bit. Part of it is the word event. Event sounds singular and temporal to me. You did say it's something that's ongoing, but it may just be that word to me. It sounds like it's just, this happens one time.
Well, it shows up once, right? And then it shows up again, and then it shows up again, and so on and so forth.
And continues to haunt you.
Indeed.
Gotcha.
And the sense of haunting, because you mentioned hauntology, you know, radical theologian John Caputo says, you know, once we've been haunted in this way, once our realities have been disrupted, it's like we've gone to sleep and we've had a dream, and in this dream we've been haunted, and we've heard whispers, and we know not of their meaning or really what's happening, but we wake up and we're just never the same again. And it's like that weird pebble in your shoe that you just can't, you know, get rid of. It's just this constant thing that has completely changed who you are and your reality, you know, irrevocably so. And Caputo says that if we try and ignore that, and if we try and resist that, it means, you know, to fall into utter despair. Like there is simply no ignoring once those sorts of realities have been changed. And that's what event does. It changes us. And if we try and ignore that, it would mean to fall into utter despair.
I did like that Caputo quote about falling to utter despair. I wrote that down for my own personal notes.
You took personal notes?
Of course, I read the whole book.
He's the model student.
I felt like I was a real good student in my New Testament class. I think I got an A, maybe an A minus, which I'm still a little upset about.
I was the best kind of student. I never did any work, and somehow they gave me not 1 but 2 degrees. Well, 3 actually, man.
You mentioned, Maria, that you had no story. The church told your story for you. Danny and I have kind of talked about conformity and how what the church seems to want is conformity. And if you conform, then you show you belong, and you're sanctified when you conform.
Sure.
You've did it. You've achieved extra Christianity when you
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in terms of, I don't know if I said it just like that, you know, I had no story. I did have a story, but it was really heavily informed, you know, by very particular realities and a very particular set of values and aims in life that really, you know, is the bedrock of evangelicalism. So in that sense, it didn't feel like my story, what I was bringing to the table, was important in any way. You know, you're told, you know, that there's not much good in you, and anything about you really needs to sort of be brought before the cross and needs to be forgiven and needs, as you use the word sanctified, you know, be made right, be made righteous before God, you know, all of this very religious, you know, penal substitutionary atonement language. And so in that sense, your story gets glossed over. And if there are good things about you, it's because God has given you those gifts. And so God needs to develop those gifts. And there's a real onus on this metaphysical reality to lead you in this way. I mean, talk about not feeling safe, talk about feeling lost and theologically lost, and not even like lost in general, because you are literally relying on an unseen reality that you are being told is a personal being that, exists to love and lead you in this way. I mean, talk about feeling around in the dark. So in that sense, there's not a lot of attention and care paid to your story, but what God's story is and how you can join this God in their story. Now, in some sense, that sounds really beautiful. Oh, let's join God in the work that God's doing in the world. Sure. But if your God is a wrathful, vengeful, judgmental, I'm sending you to hell if you don't choose me, this is not a God we want to join in their work in the world.
Speak for yourself. I'm game. With that, I think we're going to jump into an ad and we'll be right back.
Well, let's take a break for our ad here. We just want to say how grateful we are
for another new sponsor.
New sponsor.
The team over at All Pod Media is killing it getting us these new sponsors. Who do we have?
Thank you, All Pod Media, for bringing on Bible Hustlers University.
Correct.
Bible Hustlers University is a revolutionary 1.5 week online course. We're not really sure how long a half of a week is.
No.
Is it 4 days, 5 days? Because there's 7 days in a full week. Who knows? But it's a 1.5 week online course that will teach you what, Danny?
It's all about engaging with the mystery, right? That's so it starts with the length of the course. We are engaging with the mystery. This course, Bible Hustlers University, teaches you one amazing thing, and it's super short. It's really succinct, and it gets to the point. How to start your own megachurch that you can use to extract capital out of tax-free.
Yes.
To build a real estate empire.
Beautiful.
That's right.
And it's only a half a week.
That's right.
And it only costs $1,199.99.
That's right. And if you use code Church is Canceled, the full name of the podcast, code Church is Canceled, it's $2,100.
That's right. The price goes up by 10%.
Hold on, the price goes up?
That's right. Yeah, it's called a reverse discount code. They're new. They're in style.
Okay.
They're hipster.
Inflation, baby.
That's
Thanks,
right.
Biden. All right. So that is, I am honored to be sponsored by Bible Hustlers University. And if you are thinking of ways to get out of your current financial situation, you're thinking of side gigs, getting a job, saving money, paying off your high interest credit cards.
Forget about all that.
Taking Financial Peace University. Forget about all of that. You need to sign up for this course today and use code Church is Canceled for that reverse discount. And you will be on your way to starting a mega church that may or may not completely discredit the gospel going forward. But in the process, you will build a real estate empire.
Wow. What a great sponsor.
Yes.
Bible Hustlers University.
That's right.
Thank you for sponsoring us.
That's right. Also, this has nothing to do with or any relation to Bill Hybels or the gospel.
Okay, so to jump back in after our sponsor, which we're so grateful to have. We
correct.
Just love having sponsors. Maria, I want to talk a little bit more about story and how your story had been. Danny's excited to continue. How your story had been so influenced by evangelical culture. You talk a little bit about being a professor at NCU. You talk about your marriage and your divorce.
Yeah.
I was curious to see how much of your story plays into what you are thinking about and talking about now and writing about in your book. I think specifically around your divorce, and to be too personal, kind of pointed. I'm not saying this, but I could see how evangelicals in the evangelical mindset would say, oh, well, she was divorced. And she knows that's not cool and that's sinful. So obviously, instead of facing up her sins and repenting and doing the right thing, she just decided to leave and start her own faith. What would you say to that?
Nothing. I'll engage you guys. I mean, I wrote about my divorce in the book because it's actually a really important part of my life and my story. And I would never divorce, speaking of divorce, I would never divorce my story from my theological path. It's just, you can't do it. I can't do it. And, it's just not who we are to, disintegrate our stories in that manner. But if someone came up to me and asked me that question from that point of view, I would not engage this at all. Like this is a fool's errand. This is a pointless conversation to engage in with someone like that. So I wouldn't engage that with them. I'll take your question because I
just wanted to ask, you're someone who got divorced.
Sure.
So it would seem that you just took your ball and went home and said, well, if I'm just
sure,
kidding.
I see. Yeah.
You see where that was going? All right.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like I said, it's very difficult to talk about, our faith journeys and our faith transitions without, constantly keeping it in step with like our life events. Now, my divorce was a big life event, but was it my only life event? No. Was it my only life event happening at that time? No. Did because in the book, especially the first chapter, as you guys know, is fairly autobiographical because I really wanted to give people an idea of where I was coming from. My story is not an uncommon one in terms of coming out of evangelicalism and what it looks like to think through those things and, just start to churn and spiral into the future with some new theological ideas that change us. And so, I started out as a young Catholic girl in an Italian-American community in New York.
In Staten Island. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Long Island. Not close from Staten Island, but very different.
I know. I know that it's hurtful for people from Long Island to be called from Staten Island, which is precisely why I did that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's all like whatever.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter. But I hear what you're saying, and that is a very real thing. So good on you for knowing that. But I have a very diverse faith background in terms of my Christianity and my theological homes within traditional Christianity. So I was Catholic for my whole childhood. I made all the sacraments. Then we moved to an evangelical church that was fairly charismatic, did all the Jesus things for all those years of my youth. And then I went to a Bible college that was fully Assemblies of God, fully Pentecostal, really engaging in heavy Pentecostal theology and lifestyle for several years, then moving on from that to becoming progressive evangelical to post-evangelical to now post-Christian. So it wasn't a matter of like, oh, I got a divorce. I don't want to be with this God anymore, or this community. I'm going to do my own thing. This whole situation was a very slow melt, but always driven by my curiosity of what is out there? What is this thing I'm feeling? What is it? What am I experiencing? From a young girl walking into a Catholic cathedral of like, oh, wow, like there's something really big and holy in here and it's amazing. And what is it? And I need to know. And, evangelical youth group, oh, it's Jesus and Jesus loves me and saved me, to Pentecostalism. Oh, yes, I get this special prayer language and I get to worship like this. And this is so amazing. And do you know what I mean? Oh, wait, God really cares about social justice. I'm going to move in this direction. You know what I mean? So it really wasn't just this like one main event that change it all and split it all down the middle. Like we're the summation of our parts and our stories. But I think for me, the divorce was so important because that marriage was one, unhappy for a very long time, not because he was a bad guy or I was a bad person. We just were not meant to be in a marriage together. And it was a product of an evangelical culture and expectation at the time. And we did our best, but it was just not a good situation. And I think, as you're going through something that is really painful and you're not being honest about it, and you're just trying to move through it and say, everything's fine, I'm fine, it's all okay. And all of these things that you relied on that said, no, it is going to be okay. Like God has your future. He has your marriage. And I'm using he for, intentionally because, right, those evangelical God constructs are very gendered and very masculine. And all of a sudden, this God. That
we all know God has a penis, though.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
that's what I'm saying.
I didn't want to say it, but this God construct starts to vaporize into the background and really starts to sort of in a sense, wash their hands of whatever it is you're doing in your life and your future, you start to ask questions of, am I barking up the right theological tree here? And that doesn't mean that I was angry or bitter or like, holding my fist up to the sky. God, why did you? It's just like, you know what? All of these things I relied on are really starting to break down, and they're breaking down in ways that make sense, not necessarily emotional ways. And it took years. So it wasn't just like, oh, I'm divorced, I'm changing my whole life and my theological outlook. It just happened, that way. And when the divorce happened, it was the moment in time where I thought, you know what? I was really unhappy in this marriage, and I've been unhappy in my life for a long time in several different areas. Because when you're in a marriage that's really unhappy, it tends to make other areas of, you can't just compartmentalize a bad marriage, right? It affects everything. And so I get out of this marriage and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to be totally free and totally liberated. And I'm going to like think through everything and all of these constructs that failed me, my marriage, my evangelical community, my belief system. And mind you, I was well progressive and post-evangelical by this point. So it's not like I was some little fundamental girl who was shook. I was already in seminary. I was already thinking through these things, but I just thought I am never, ever going to be held by anything that I don't want to be held by ever again, whether it's an unhappy marriage or an unhappy God or, a geographic location. I just wanted more of life, and that meant more of all of life. So that's how the divorce fits into all of this.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. I know that's more of a personal thing.
Well, I talk about it in the book, so it's totally all there for people to jump into.
You do. And I think we saw you, both Danny and I, in Chicago that weekend. You mentioned you were on the train going to Chicago. Yeah. We saw you that weekend. I had no idea all that was going on. I think you told me later. So
that was it.
Yeah. So definitely an important piece. But like you said, we can't, it sounds like we can't divorce our story from our faith. Yeah. Our faith doesn't occur in a vacuum. The whole story is important. And I know it started very early on for you. You mentioned being in church camp and asking about the book of life and saying, well, what if my name's not really written in the book of life? I just think it is. Because why would God write it and then erase it? He would know that I'm going to change my mind later. So he probably just never wrote it down. And the youth leaders didn't know how to respond to that at all. We'll just forget about it. Don't think about that.
Yeah. God's got it all under control. No, I had so many questions as a young girl, as a young Christian. I was always a little bit of a thinker, and I was always super curious. And not only did, people in my life at the time not know what to do or how to answer these questions, but eventually I just stopped asking the questions. Eventually I got so embedded in and entangled in a culture that didn't ask questions because God's ways are higher and God's ways are more mysterious, and, God's taking care of everything and we don't have to worry. We don't have to worry what's going to happen tomorrow because God's got us, type of thing. And that theology, that outlook of life is really toxic and can get people into a lot of trouble because you're just not taking responsibility for yourself or your life. But yeah, you eventually squelch the questions, and that curiosity gets, dimmed and burnt out and all that.
I think you, to change gears a little bit, you had a quote that just really triggered Danny. He got really triggered. And so he has a bone to pick with you about what you said about capitalism. Danny, would you like to pick that bone?
Well, I mean, in chapter 2, Brett prepped these questions for me. So he's teeing this up, but because I wasn't going to read this book, we all know that. In chapter 2, you say capitalism has failed us and that digital capitalism has fragmented us. Now, on this doll here, where did I put it? Well, can you show us where capitalism specifically hurt you?
I totally see the tree you're barking up. Let me just say this. That section of the book, it was not an indictment on capitalism, and it was not to make a personal opinion known on capitalism. The reason why I bring up digital capitalism is because I am referencing an Italian worker activist who, came of age, if you will, in the 70s to fight for the rights of workers in Italy, and is now, a formidable philosopher in his own right. And so he talks about what happens when the future has been completely decimated. What happens when, the 20th century can no longer make good on its promises of the 21st century? What happens when growth is completely unbridled and unfettered and it cannot sustain a future? And he does all of this couched in a critique of not only capitalism with digital capitalism, because he says digital capitalism essentially disintegrates a community, and we lose social cohesion. Now, for me, I thought this was a great example of the promises of Christianity and how the promises of traditional Western Christianity simply cannot deliver into the 21st century. That if you look at all the statistics across the board, it's not an opinion, like it's proven in the data. And I go into some of those numbers in chapter 2, just to kind of set us up for the rest of the book and, the culture that we're sort of working out of here. So that is why I talk about Franco Berardi, and that is why I even mentioned capitalism, because those are his words. And I say, well, this is what he's saying about digital capitalism, but actually, like, this is what happens when a future has just blown up as a result of anything. This is what it looks like to sit in the rubble of anything. So, I don't really care to talk about capitalism in the book per se.
Clearly,
I was sort of just referencing. But I can tell you're a fan, and that's okay. I don't need to say I'm a fan or not. It's totally not my axe to grind at the moment. Maybe in the next book.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll just leave that one there.
Is that satisfying?
No, not at all. But I'm
satisfied. I'm satisfied with that.
I could invite you, Danny. I could invite you to talk about capitalism, but I would not be a good conversation partner for you.
I don't care though. That's the thing, is like, I just simply uninterested in that conversation with people who don't know what they're saying. Yeah.
Same.
But there is something that where we do perhaps agree. You say that patriotism has become enmeshed with what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and that Christian nationalism is on the rise. Now, I might
did an episode about this.
Yeah, I might agree with you, but what is the problem with people having a sense of community and identity within the context of being American and Christian at the same time?
Yeah. Inherently, is there an issue in claiming an identity? No, it's not possible to go through life as a human without claiming some kind of border, nationality, ethnicity, whatever you want to say. When I make a slight nod to Christian nationalism in chapter 2, because it is, in my opinion, one of 4 main events that happened in the 20th century that is really affecting what we're seeing happening with Christianity in America at the moment. So if you want to read an indictment on Christian nationalism, I could give you several books off the top of my head right now. But that is not what I was doing. Even though I have my own opinions on Christian nationalism, certainly, it was not a critique. It was a setting up of, this is what's happened in the last half a century with Christianity. Here's what we have with Christian nationalism, the religious right, the death of God movement, 9/11 did crazy amounts of things to resurge, interest in religious fundamentalism. Like, I was naming several events that, in my opinion, really kind of brought us to where we are in 2023 with some of these really dark statistics that we're seeing in terms of Christianity and belief and faith in the West, but predominantly, of course, in the US. So that was the point.
I mean, that is a subject that we have discussed on this podcast. So yeah.
And it is an important one to discuss for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a pretty scathing indictment of the whole concept, but that's neither here nor there in the context of this dialogue, I think so.
Yeah, we on Church's Canceled podcast do tend to indict absolutely everyone and everything, which it seems Maria is not doing in her book here.
Well, so, Brett's doing the indicting. I'm saying everything's cool, man. Let's all just be friends. But
to be fair, I'm more talking past things.
Yeah, no, I get it.
If someone came up to, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, like, people try and trap me all the time and like, well, what do you believe about this? And what do you think about this? And Brett and I have had these conversations in the past. These are conversations I'm totally uninterested in, and questions I have no desire to answer. And it's not because I don't have some personal thoughts about those things, but You are asking me the wrong question. We are having the wrong conversation. This is not going to yield theological transformation or any other transformation for that matter. So I in that sense, I do talk past things. I'm transcending conversations that go back and forth like a ping pong match where we don't get anywhere.
Yeah.
I'm hopping that track. The one thing I do indict in my book is circles, right? I talk about the circles piece and no more circles, and we're hopping that
You want
track.
more circles or no more circles? I don't know.
No more circles. Exactly.
Chapter
1.
I'll ask it. Sorry, Danny.
No, I mean, one of the things I talk about on this podcast is having rejected the concept of democracy, and in its entirety. And part of that is I don't care about explaining anything to anyone or defending my ideas to anyone. If people don't like it, they don't agree. Actually, when we were in Chicago, that was one thing. Like I was explaining some of my theology, and at that time you were like, that's silly. And
did I say that? I mean, how many years were like 8 years maybe?
I don't know if you use the words that's silly. It might have been something else, but I find it hilarious that we all ended up back right here. So
it's full circle, if you will.
We did it
off the podcast for that.
All right.
I have a question that you probably will engage with here, Maria. It's going to be a 2-parter. So when you tell someone you're Christian, they usually know what you mean.
Sure.
I had a guy come into my job, doesn't know me at all the other day. He was a pastor, and he's like, "Are you a Christian?" And I was just like, "I'm not going to get into it with this guy." So, yep, absolutely. And you just said, "Okay, good." Like there's so many like presuppositions and things built into that. But people kind of know what you mean. But when you say you're post-Christian, you explained what it is. But how could would someone just give them the real quick answer when they say, well, how do you tell someone? How do you come out? And how do you come out to people and say, I'm post-Christian? How do you explain that? That's part 1. I'll ask part 2 later, actually separate.
Okay. It's a weird thing. I haven't had to answer a question like that for nobody's walked up to me in a long time and said, what are you? Are you a Christian? Are you atheist? Are you this? Are you that?
To reframe it, I was telling people, we're having this a guest on the podcast, and she has a book about post-Christianity. They say, what is that? And I can't do a good job explaining it.
Yeah. Honestly, I mostly just say, if people want to label me as Christian, that's fine. But I also say, as a theologian, I'm engaging Christianity after, past traditional notions of what people usually think about Christianity. And if people want the quick answer, they go, okay, that's curious, whatever. They stop there. If they want to talk more, I'm happy to do that. But, again, it's about changing our orientation to the whole thing, and engaging with it completely differently and beyond any way we might have thought was possible. Usually it's engage Christianity this way and live it out this way, or you're an atheist or at best agnostic. And we just don't have to deal with those awful categories anymore. We know we shouldn't have to. So.
Yeah, you did say it's kind of a trip down a rabbit hole. We're following the Mad Hatter in ways, and that we arrive at no particular destination. As you mentioned earlier, we're not really trying to arrive anywhere. It's about the journey. So maybe the fact that we can't answer that question when someone says, well, what are you? Maybe that makes sense.
Well, and I talk a lot about, because, I haven't put out a book, for our listeners, I haven't put out a book that just says enjoy the journey, man. Like, that's kind of what it's all about. Maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't, but I'm really, I set it up by talking a little bit about my story. So maybe people can identify bits of their story in mine somewhere, because it's not an uncommon one, but I'm really inviting people into, a new theological imagination. I talk a lot about radical theology and what it means to talk about God as being, as event and as experience. I talk about what it looks like to go from a knowable God to an unknowable one, from a conditional God to an unconditional one, from a very possible reality of God to an impossible one, and why these things are important, and what it looks like to talk about God in terms of weakness and folly and depth, as opposed to the high and mighty God. I talk about deconstruction a la Jacques Derrida, because it is this word that is such a buzzword right now. But if people knew, and I'm not really sure how deconstruction got attributed to the pop culture conversation on leaving Christianity, or at the very least evangelicalism, but true philosophical deconstruction is amazingly exciting, and it invites us into this vast wildness of event, of this sense of perhaps, which is really, what people like John Caputo would say is the only way to engage the future, by saying perhaps it is all possible, or perhaps not. It's a sense of just holding so much loosely, but it is not something, it's something to hold loosely, but it's not something to take lightly. And so my book is really trying to take some, as people might have guessed, some really lofty ideas that tend to stay in the ivory tower, tucked away, never really making it to, again, pop culture, where these ideas, if engaged, could be really useful and transformative and meaningful. I'm trying to take some of that stuff and dispense it and make it accessible. Like you said in the beginning of the podcast, Brett, you said, I've read a couple of these books here and there over the last several years, but you put it in a way where you're synthesizing everything and you're serving it up and you're making it make sense. You did. And you're in that sense, you're my ideal reader, because I want to take a lot of these resources where most people are not going to go to seminary or go to higher levels of university or get their heads in theology. But, I want to take all the work that I've done for the past, 10 or 15 years and put it in this book and say, engage this, like, even if it throws your mind for a total spin, like, let it challenge you. Like, there's some things people read the book and go, oh yeah, that resonates, I get it. And there are going to be some things where it's like, oh my God, I don't really understand that at all. Well, good. Like, I want you to feel both and so.
I want to take all of these concepts and stuff them back in the ivory tower and then burn it down. But that's just me.
That is an option. You could do that.
Danny's usual
there are
approach.
Books out there that want to do it, that want to do that. Yeah.
I said that was a two-part question. Kind of not. So this is post-Christianity. This is the book you've written.
Take it easy with the praise hands there.
You mentioned pastoring people through the grief and loss of faith. And you definitely helped to do that for me at various points in my life, whether you know it or not. So thank you for being there when you were needed. Now I don't so much feel the grief and loss, as I struggle not to argue with or make fun of both atheists and Christians. Sure. Can you point me to a better way? Is there a better way to evangelize, if you will?
Like evangelize this kind of stuff that we're talking about?
Yeah, if you're trying to help others understand post-Christianity, how do you reach them without arguing or making fun of people?
Having fun, and making fun is one thing, but if you're constantly just trying to tear down one set of beliefs, it's just not helpful. There's just nothing generative about that. Or so I know that there are a lot of people who are bitter and who are angry and who have been through trauma and who have been abused. And if that is the case, if you've been through a trauma in a church context, you need to pursue therapy. You need to pursue a sense of wholeness and healing, and the work needs to be done there. If
you're at Ted Haggard's church and he got a little too close to you.
Well, that's one example that could actually go into abuse. If you really feel like you've been abused and laws have been broken, that kind of thing needs to be held accountable. In a
the guy brushes up against you one time and all of a sudden he's a convict. I mean, he just wanted to say how
these things have to be pursued in certain, ways. But if you just want to sit around and say oh, I've been done so wrong, I've been done so dirty by the church, and just go on and on about this is not helpful. And this is why I talk past these conversations, because you can do that. But like I said, there's nothing generative or regenerative about comment. So it's okay to be there for a little while, because that is part of the grief process, that anger, and that rage, but you do have to go on, and you do have to move past it. In some situations, maybe you'll need proper therapy. There are a lot of therapists out there who are specializing in religious trauma syndrome. That's really up and coming. But in terms of just talking about this is how the word gets out. People like me, will write a book about something, or you go, lecture someplace, or do, work in some way, or, whatever it is, just having those conversations. And that's why, even though I know, Danny, you said you're not really interested in like things that pop culture grabs onto, even though this,
interested isn't the right word. It's so boring. That's
Sure.
a better way. If it only gave you pause to think about it now because everyone else is thinking about it,
sure,
I feel like we're all stupid.
Well, it doesn't seem authentic either.
That's a better way to put it. It seems really like,
I hear you. I've actually talked to people on both sides of this, like people who literally cannot stand the deconstruction crowd at the moment, and not because they're like conservative evangelicals and they want to buy back their doubt or whatever. It's just because they just don't like how the conversation is being handled. And then of course, like there's people who are pro deconstruction, whatever. For me, I kind of see both sides, and I have a lot of time for people who are genuinely seeking, because they've been hurt and they're feeling a loss of identity, and there's grief, and they're trying to anchor themselves to a movement because they were anchored to a movement that have failed them in some way. And so, when something becomes popular because, someone's saying this and now everyone's saying it because they're grabbing onto what this person said, sometimes you need someone like me to come along and say, well, this is how we're talking about this stuff now. And I know we haven't used this language in this kind of way, but it might be really helpful to talk about God in this way as opposed to that way. And maybe people grab onto it and they say, oh, I really like that set of language. I like that set of words. I like so we can't really criticize, I think, too much for, people saying, oh, they're giving creed and they're giving substance and they're giving articulation to things I've been feeling but haven't been able to articulate myself. Like, I think that's okay. But essentially it just comes down to a lot of people have experienced a lot of brokenness out of stories that we're very familiar with. So I do have time for it. I do. But again, if someone came to me and, I see people throw stuff on social media all the time that is just so prickly and so,
to me, it's self-absorbed. I think that's probably the best way to describe it is like, it's so self-involved, and as a personal temperament, I just don't have patience for like, hey man, there's more to it than, not only is there more to it than you, it just doesn't matter that much that like, so somebody said something you disagreed with or what have you, and it hurt your feelings. We all get our feelings hurt. That's life. Yeah. Obviously, if somebody touched you, that's a different thing, but
right. No. And I totally get that. And I think that's why I said a little while ago, like, I never had that moment, you guys, where I like put my hand to the sky and said, God, how dare you? How could you? It was never that. It was just like,
at least that I could understand. I don't know what happened for the last hour and a half.
Well, hopefully you can watch the playback and get a better handle on it.
That's
I
right.
did. There was never this moment of like, oh, you disappointed me and you weren't there for me, so I'm out. It was really a slow churn and change into something else, into the next part of my engagement with my Christianity as I see it. And that's the story I'm sort of sticking to. Like, nobody gets to tell me I'm not a Christian. Nobody gets to tell me that like I'm not engaging my faith well and meaningful. Do you know what I mean? But people try, but they don't get to do that. So I do understand the self-absorbed piece. I did not have that moment where I was like, oh my God, how could you do? I took responsibility for what was happening in my life.
I wasn't leveling an accusation. I was just saying like, that's part of where the deconstruction dialogue for me falls off the rails, is so self-absorbed. And it's from a group of people who dialogue about it in a way that's self-absorbed, who are constantly talking about how everyone else is so selfish and self-absorbed. And that's like an axe they have to grind. and their inability to see their own hypocrisy in that regard also makes me want to just bop them over the head with an office chair. I've never done that before, but I mean,
no, I mean, but the other thing we have to remember about the self-absorbed, because I will agree with you, there are like huge parts of the current deconstruction conversation that self-absorbed, which is why I wanted to devote quite a bit of my book to, I think, deconstruction that is the opposite of self-absorbed, and how maybe we should be using it, or in a sense, how it was birthed to be used. But we have to remember that the self-absorption piece just gets translated. Like, what's more self-absorbed than like evangelical theology, believing that it's all about you and God's will for your life? Like, those habits don't die hard, like don't die easy. They die really hard. You can't just pick someone out. This is where like it becomes impossible to divorce, your story, AKA how your brain has been shaped and formed in some really formative years of one's childhood or youth around these ideas. So, you pick someone out of evangelicals and you put them down in a more progressive context, they're still going to feel that, centering themselves in that story, because that's what they were taught to do. And there, in that sense, there's some unlearning that needs to happen. And that is why I think it's so important to tread lightly, to tread with the sense of theological humility and hermeneutical humility, how we interpret, how we engage. Like, it's tough out there. It's tough. And I get it.
I did have one more question I wanted to ask. I know we're running low on time here. In your epilogue, you dare us to be like Satan. Can you explain that? That's what you did. Can you explain that without being canceled? That's what you said. I'm sticking to it.
Danny, did you read the epilogue? Because that's like
no.
the one part.
No, I didn't.
It's super short. You're really gonna like it.
I'll pass, but okay.
Just give it a shot.
All right.
Give it a shot. No, so the epilogue is all about this crazy memory I had when I was a child of sitting in the back seat and having this, moment of like, well, everyone tells me I should pray to Jesus for people I love to get saved so that everyone can go to heaven. And I was a little girl and this makes sense. So I'm praying for people who aren't going to church, and I'm praying for my friends and a family member here and there, blah, blah, blah. So I just asked my mom, I said, well, if this is the case, like, shouldn't we be praying for the devil to get saved? Like, if God gave the devil forgiveness and you just told me that God wants everybody to be forgiven and to be in heaven with him and blah, 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 like, shouldn't we be praying for this reality? And it was like, no, like, that is the one person you should not like waste your prayers on, and it was this, and I didn't, I stopped praying for the devil. I stopped having kind of any hope, but it didn't make sense.
That's why he's not saved yet.
The devil turned, and that would alleviate all of our problems. But I don't say in the book that we should be like Satan. But I do challenge us to sort of rethink, so many things that we were told about ideology and holiness and what it looks like to be in right relationship with yourself and your community, and what it looks like to subvert ideas that used to be so solid and long-standing, but actually can't really hold up. And so what does it look like if we started praying devilish prayers, not in like a traditional way we pray, but, as a metaphor in our life, to pray, AKA dream, imagine, wonder, pursue things that, were only beyond our wildest dreams. And so that is essentially what I am challenging, not to be like the person we have come to know as, the devil in the
Sorry if I misquoted you there. Thank you for clarifying.
I like it.
Danny, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to close us out by saying, Maria, thank you for coming on. You're canceled. Brett, also, you're canceled.
Danny, you are also canceled.
Oh, thank you so much. I finally belong.
Everyone, the book is Safer Than the Known Way by the author, Dr. Maria Francesca French. Thank you so much for joining us.
We'll have a link in the description for the book when it becomes available.
It is available.
That's what I meant. Whatever.
Yeah.
Where can they get it?
They can get it wherever: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, all of this. If you get it from Amazon, would love a rate and review. Really important to new authors like myself. And if you want to follow what I'm up to, head to my website, mariafrancescafrench.com. Anything I'm involved in, my social media, my Patreon, if you want to, get in touch with me in some way, it's all there. So would love to hear from anybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
you.